I'm so pleased you've joined us for another After Dinner Leadership Conversation where I introduce you to my new guest, David Pullan. David is a story spotter and he calls himself a chief alchemist. What does that mean? He takes the elements of a story, along with his clients, he crafts it into something with them to make it golden. And I was pleased to be on the receiving end of that. At the tail end of our conversation, I told a story and he helped me to enhance it. Take a listen and see the effect. I am really pleased with what you'll learn from today. The first thing is about recognizing as a leader that you are storyteller in chief. The second thing is to realize that you can bring passion and emotion appropriately into a story. We talk about one buttock storytelling. And lastly, there is a bit of structure to this. We looked at different elements of that, but the ABT structure, listen out for how you can use that as a formula to get people engaged with the content that you're sharing. I'm sure you're going to learn a lot from this conversation. I certainly did. And please be willing to share it and to bring other people into this community. So as you share and like this episode, other people get to listen to it and benefit from it too. Thank you so much for your support and enjoy the story with David. Welcome, David, to our After Dinner Leadership Conversation. It's lovely to have you here.
Simon, it's an utter joy. And to be set up as having an after dinner conversation makes me both excited and slightly hungry.
I agree. Actually, yeah, what the listener won't know is that we are actually recording this just before dinner. So it's not quite fair, is it?
Yeah. It's not really not
but you're
fair,
also a resident story spotter. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means a little bit later in the show. But I'm excited to talk about story and the importance of story to leaders. And thank you for joining us again. It is our custom to ask a series of quick fire questions to our guests as soon as they arrive. Is that all right?
Of course it is. Yeah, absolutely it is. Very happy. And slightly trepidatious.
Good. That's perfect. Perfect poise. Here we go.
Excellent.
Name.
David Pullan.
Organisation.
The Story Spotters.
Current position.
Founder and Chief Alchemist.
Who is a leader that inspired you when you were a young adult?
A leader that inspired me when I was a young adult. I was an actor before I got into this world, and I worked in a very famous production of Richard III for the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the lead actor in that, Sir Anthony Sher, now sadly dead, was a leader who inspired me.
Great. What's a great piece of advice you've received?
You're always communicating from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed.
Right. What's your go-to karaoke song?
You Can Keep Your Hat On, Tom Jones, and there's a story behind that.
Go on.
I was working for AXA, the insurer, at a chateau that they own, which bordered Chateau d'Yquem near Bordeaux. And it was a broker event, which was really, really enjoyable and really well catered. And after the night when I delivered our session with my wife, basically we had to stay up and sort of work with the clients, entertain the clients. There was a billiard room which was lined with Armagnac and cognac, which I saw as a challenge. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, my wife found me in the karaoke room, about to have a karaoke off with a broker from Stoke. I was about to take my shirt off and sing You Can Keep Your Hat On with this broker, and my wife, Sarah Jane, pointed me and said, David, bed. Now. It would have been a great rendition, though.
Well, we might save that for later in the show.
That's extras.
Thank you. There's a couple of things from what else you mentioned. Chief Alchemist. What? That's an unusual title. What does it mean?
Yeah, it is really. I mean, because, one of the things about stories, I think stories have to surprise. And so, thankfully, it's worked in this case because you've gone, what does that mean? And actually, my job really is to take, as a story spotter, is to not tell the stories, but help organisations spot and shape and share their stories. And it's that shaping of their facts and the things that they are trying to achieve, which is the alchemy, really. It's taking the raw material of their facts and helping them turn them into stories that are going to move hearts and minds.
So give us a little bit of context to the type of work that you're doing then. What does that actually mean in practice? Who are you working with to help do that?
Well, there are a number of organisations. I mean, a big client for me at the moment is Aviva, the British insurer, who are now they're headquartered in London. They have operations in Canada and Ireland. And Amanda Blanc, who is the CEO there, has been a massive supporter of my wife, Sarah Jane, and I, even before we became the Story Spotters. And so a big piece of work we're doing there at the moment is, like everyone, there are huge changes going on within every organisation, and the senior leadership can't do it all themselves, nor should they have to be able to do it themselves. So the change that Amanda is instilling with the organisation needs to cascade down. And the leadership below her have to have the skills to be able to get people engaged and get them on board and want to follow on this journey. So once they have decided what particularly it is that they're going to do within their part of the organization, we go in. In fact, we've got our last two this week. It's been a year-long program. Go in there and we spend a whole session with them, helping them to create both the narrative and the story, because I would say there is a difference between narrative and story, and you need to keep control of the narrative and then see the narrative almost like the hook, if you like. It's the hook, which is a much overused word, but the narrative is the hook, but then you need to bait that hook as well, and the stories are the bait that go onto that hook. So that's a big piece of work, and I work with a couple of the big four on pitches as well when they're pitching for work. How do they create the story within well, actually I work for one of the big four and some other organizations, helping them create the stories that, as I say, are going to engage and stick in the room with people afterwards beyond the facts. Sure.
Oh, that's fascinating work. And one more question on that. Is that about helping the storyteller themselves to bring out their own personal stories into the room, or is it something else?
Yes, and it's something else. I often with leadership, I mean, this is obviously what we're here to talk about today, is, I mean, I'm a great believer in, there's a man called Marshall Gantz, who I'm sure you've heard of at Harvard Kennedy, who came up with the concept of the public narrative. And the idea behind the public narrative is the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. Why is this important now? And so that starts with the leadership story. It's about, why is this important to me? I mean, most famously, he worked with Obama in the 2008 election. So it was Obama's story, why that related to America as a whole, the United States as a whole.
Yes.
And then why the urgency was right here and now. As a model, I love that, and I work a lot with that. So sometimes when leaders are working, like Amanda will tell her own personal story and why that is important to the organization, why it happens now. And indeed, partners who are leading up a pitch, why is this important to them and what is that going to mean? But then to the other side of the question, you can tell a future-based story about sort of essentially what is this going to look and feel like in the future, working either with that organization or having these changes, this strategy embedded within the organization. So combination of the two, I'd say.
Yeah. You mentioned about working on the stage prior to that. How did you make the leap from stage to boardroom, or how did that go on?
I wasn't quick enough to say no. It was acting is a perilous position. I mean, it's basically feast or famine. So I mean, and I was relatively successful. I mean, I was working with good companies. But our son was born, Sarah Jane, who is my business partner and also my wife. Our son was born. Sarah Jane actually got into this work first and was very, very successful at it. And she was so successful that she was essentially over trading. And I had dipped my toes into this work. I was working at an organisation called the City Lit, which is an adult education college in the centre of London. They have a very successful 3-year drama course, and I used to teach on the speech side of that once a week.
Yes.
And they asked me to create a weekend long course called Your Voice is the Business, which was transferable skills essentially for business leaders, which went down quite well. So I dipped my toes in it. But then one day, Sarah Jane, very busy, she essentially woke up and couldn't get out of bed because she'd got chronic fatigue. I mean, she was utterly exhausted, and she had to ring up the people who were in charge of these two massive projects, one in Zurich and one in London, and said, basically, I can't come in. Now, I don't know exactly what was said on the other end of the phone, but I suspect it was something like, do you know anybody who would take over? Because I remember her going, yes, I think I do. That was me. And so I quickly found myself in Zurich, helping for a pitch for about 20 million francs worth of work for Swiss Re, surrounded by people who might as well have been speaking Greek to me. I had no idea. It was the time of Sarbanes-Oxley. I knew nothing about what they were talking about. And at the first break, I ran out and I called Sarah Jane on my very old mobile phone at the time. I said, please get me out of here. This is a disaster. And she said, what's wrong? And I said, well, I don't know what they're talking about. And she said, probably the best piece of advice I've ever been given. She said, if you don't know what they're talking about, you can be pretty sure they're not 100% sure what they're talking about. Do what you've always done. Get them to tell a story about what this is going to look and feel like, having them working with Swiss Re. And I thought, well, I can do that. Went back into the room, brainstormed some stories. Those stories became sort of hub and spoke, really. They were the hub of the pitch, off which the spokes of the various elements, the fact sat. Yes. 20 odd years later, here I am, still getting people to tell stories that prove their facts.
Well, thank you, David. And one of the reasons that I was really keen to speak with you today is that I've obviously followed some of the work you do online, and I just love the passion at which you communicate. And there's just a great, I'd say, like there's a mischievous energy that I pick up as well. It's just like a cheekiness that there's also kind of thing. And I share that as a compliment, not as a criticism. It's just like
I take
it's
it
very
as
endearing.
Thank you.
It's very endearing, that I was like, all right. What's around the next corner? There's something here that you keep kind of a sense of little suspense coming through that. So thank you for bringing that. Now we'd love to find out, what are the 3 leadership lessons you wish you'd learned earlier? Let's explore those together.
I really thought about when you asked me this before we met, and I think that the 3 are. And again, there are probably stories around all these as well. The first one is that leaders are always visible. It comes back to that. It comes back to my best piece of advice, really. You are communicating from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed. Leaders are always telling a story via their behaviors as much as anything. So lesson number 1, you are always visible as a leader, and you need to be able to be aware of that. The second one is leaders often get promoted for a business case because they're technically very good. Leaders should really know that that they should have, alongside CEO or MD or whatever it is, storyteller in chief, and we can go deeper into that. I mean, I think the role of the storytelling leader is hugely important because of the signals it gives off, the way it directs people in the organization on what to concentrate on, and validates and creates hope, all sorts of things. And then the last thing is actually something I posted about this morning on LinkedIn, which is I think just be aware that leadership starts well before you get given the badge. You are always leading. There's a wonderful book called The Art of Possibility by Benjamin and Rosamund Zander. And Ben Zander, I'm sure you know this book, was or is the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic, and his wife was a family therapist. Excuse me, the book, one of the big lessons from that is the concept of leading from any chair. So, the ecosystem of an orchestra, there is, of course, somebody waving a baton in front, but the ecosystem works because, the first violin is listening to the second violin, and the second violin is listening to, and they are influencing each other. So the third lesson is really about you are always leading, and just don't underestimate how much that starts from the moment you walk through the door of an organization, no matter how young you are.
Have you seen his TED Talk?
Oh, no, I haven't.
Oh, you must look out for it, David. It's
Oh, wow.
absolutely delightful. And as an expert in storytelling, he does a fantastic job. I mean, one of the things that sticks in my mind, it's not the main point, but it talks about one buttock piano playing, and just the getting into the music and the really understanding the rhythm, and he has the audience in the palm of his hand. It's a beautiful piece about culture and communicating effectively and leadership. I expect it's all woven from the book. I've not read his book, but
it's a great
and
book.
it's a really powerful. Like, he speaks to the heart as well as the head. It's just an awesome bit of oratory.
That.
Yeah,
thank you. I love that. One buttock piano playing. See, there's an image.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, he's talking about sitting on the chair, by the way, rather than playing with his buttock. But it's like, well, it's the rhythm that you put into it, that you're actually on one buttock as you're playing, rather than clonking and pounding the keys. Yeah.
Do you know, that's interesting? I mean, I think it's that thing about it sort of plays into you are always communicating. And another great TED Talk that which everyone will have seen, the Ken Robinson one, which is one of the there's so much to take away from it, but one of the the things that always makes me laugh whenever I see it is that concept of we treat our bodies as the vehicle that takes our head from meeting to meeting, and it's sort of, rather than actually embodying our message, our leadership, whatever you like. And so the one buttock is really about sort of get your whole body into the piano playing, and I think
it is
that is true of messaging, storytelling, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I love those. Would like to explore them some more. In fact, I'll start with your second point about storyteller in chief. And okay, so this is an interesting one, and I totally concur with it. But how do you help somebody, whether it's a CEO or a senior leader in an organization, come to the realization of their role as story spotter, storyteller? How do you help them to bridge that gap?
There is a particular slide that I use, that I often show to people, whether it's on a training course, whether it's one-to-one coaching, whatever. And this slide basically is a picture of a van parked on a street outside an apartment block, and it says, I don't know if you noticed, but Mark's van was parked outside Karen's house like that last night. And I say to people, what's going on there? And people usually say, well, they're obviously having an affair, or Mark's parking space was, taken, and so he had to ask Karen if he could park outside her place. People come up with a motive and a reason for it, to which I say, this is so interesting, because there is no story in that picture. What there is a bunch of facts, there's a bunch of data. We know there are two people called Mark and Karen. There's a third person who's talking about them. There's an apartment block, and there's a van and a parking space. What you have done instantaneously is created meaning around that by giving a context, by giving a motive, by giving an outcome of what that actually means in the world and what the future means. You've done all of that in a millisecond. And it's what we do as human beings, whether we like it or not. It's hardwired into us, a much overused phrase in story, but it's how we make sense of our lives. So what I say to them is, you can stand in front of your people or talk to your people, whether it's a fireside chat or a webinar or whatever it is. You can spout the facts as much as you want. What you have to realize is that everyone, because for survival reasons and for sense meaning reasons, we will take those facts and go, so what does that mean to me? What does that mean to me? And what might get in the way of that? And how am I going to overcome it? And the thing that comes from that is, they are telling a story. It is not necessarily the story that you will want them to be telling. So it's and as soon as that happens, back to my point about narrative and story, if it's not the story you want them to be telling, you've lost control of the narrative, which is deadly for a leader. So I tend to start from that angle.
Yeah. What a great thing. And what are some of the obstacles that you find are most common that you're helping these people to work with or overcome to have a more impactful story?
Sometimes it's just overcoming that thing about actually that example tends to win the intellectual case of story quite quickly.
Sure.
Sometimes there's an obstacle about people thinking, do I need to be telling my story? Is my story relevant here? This word authenticity and vulnerability comes up time and time again on my feed, certainly in LinkedIn at the moment. Which what does that mean? So, a lot of people think, well, I'm a leader, I've got to show my strength. And I think it's sometimes important to reframe, what do we mean by strength? Because I've worked with a number of people in lower down in organizations who said, oh, well, I wish I could be like that person there. What they don't realize is the struggle that person has, the journey, the struggle, the challenges that person has gone to be their CEO. So I think overcoming the need to be seen as the all-powerful boss is a gift that leaders can give, and that's sometimes a struggle to get people to understand that. And then the other thing is I love sustainability in the stories, and what I mean by that is actually sort of finding stories and thinking, how can I engineer this bit of my life in order to make a point? So depending which angle you take into a story, you can make many different points. So getting people to embrace that within their creative imagination of storytelling is it's fun, but it's a challenge as well.
Yeah, I could see that. And how do I develop this as a skill if I'm starting out in my career, or recognizing, I resonate with David's point, but here I am at the beginning of my working life. What are some of the methods I could use to start developing this early on?
Well, you can start by realizing you probably do it every single day of your life. As soon as you're sitting around after dinner and you've got the remnants of the red wine in your hand, or you're at the pub, or you're with your auntie at Christmas time, whatever it is. I mean, you're doing this every single day of your life. And just realizing that the skill is very natural, it just needs a little bit of refining and a bit of intentionality in order to be a leader, really. And that's about the structure, which we can come to as well if you want to think about that. And then just being aware of some very simple things. I mean, there's a colleague of mine called David Hutchins who wrote a wonderful book called Story Dash. And he's very into this idea of, we get hung up on the idea of the epic story and the hero's journey. And how often do you get an opportunity to tell those in life? I mean, it's nobody sits and listens to you for 5 minutes. Well, it's just, unless you're giving a big presentation, when they might, even then they'd get a bit bored. But there are very small, intentional image creations as much as anything that you can do with people. So realizing the skill is within you, then understanding what the basic structure is, and also what some base elements are that actually make people's brains fire up and the stories stick in their minds.
Yeah, we covered some of those elements with Simon Lancaster on a previous show recently. So we weren't. He's a great guy, and that's how we met, is through the connection there. And so I don't necessarily want to go through the kind of art of rhetoric. No. Mine is very. Although Simon, in what I would say is that Simon's work absolutely adds in to what I do. I mean, if you think about it, the art of rhetoric is, you bait the hook with the story, you create the hook with the narrative, you bait it with the story, and then you superpower that bait with some of Simon's work, or all of Simon's work, with the rhetoric. I mean, it's unbelievable what he does. It is brilliant. And so you mentioned the basic structure. Perhaps we could go there. That I think that would be really helpful for people to think, well, what's the basic structure of a story then, and maybe this, avoiding the risk of it being sounding formulaic. That this what's your thoughts on that would help somebody with the basic structure?
I think the thing to realize is that in life we are essentially living our life in narrative. We are living our life in story. And what do I mean by that? And it's three elements of situation, complication, resolution, dream, nightmare, action, whatever you want to call it, act one, act two, act three.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is this: we all wake up with dreams of how the day is going to work out. From the moment where we wake up and thinking, oh, I'm really looking forward to going downstairs and opening up the fridge and getting out the eggs and making my favourite scrambled eggs before I get on the train. That's our dream. And what's that going to mean to us? It's going to mean that I've really set up for the day ahead. We get down to the fridge, we open it up, we find out our son's eaten all the eggs and we haven't got any left. That's the problem. Very quickly, as human beings, we then realign and get an outcome where we think, okay, I'm going to dash down to the shops, buy half a dozen eggs, I can make myself a quick omelette before I get on the train. We are constantly living our lives in this sequence of dream, nightmare, action, situation, complication, resolution, which is sort of a short form version of the hero's journey. And it happens all the time. We have ambitions. We think it's going to work out like this. Rarely does life work out exactly as we want it to be. So the basic story is context. And this is what when I'm talking about telling stories, you can connect into that basic structure of how we operate in life as problem-solving, sense-seeking animals.
Yes.
You can connect to that. You can connect to people's dreams. You can say, listen, I understand exactly where it is you want to go to. And if you get there, then this is going to mean this to you. But, problem, this is what's going to get in the way of it. Therefore, this is how I suggest we get past it. And that structure, which is actually called the ABT framework, which I learned from a man called Randy Olson, who was originally an evolutionary biologist at Harvard and then became a documentary filmmaker at USC, now runs a very wonderful organization called the ABT course, working with a lot of US agencies. And Sarah Jane and I actually work alongside him sometimes. And that framework of the ABT, this is what you want to achieve. And if you get there, then it's going to mean this. But you're not going to get there because this might happen. The eggs have been eaten. Therefore, you can have your eggs and your omelette by going down to the shop and buying some more. That's the essential basic 3-act structure. Right, it runs through our lives. Does that make sense?
Love it. Yeah, it does. It does. It's really helpful, actually. So the ABT. So and, but, therefore is the
and,
key
but,
word.
therefore are the prompts, actually. I mean, do you know, funny enough, I'm actually writing you probably can't see it. There's a whiteboard behind me. Randy gave me an amazing gift, actually, because we've been working with this for some time, and I was on a call to him about a month ago, I think, and I said, Randy, I think I've got using your framework, I've got a different way of, an addition to it in terms of how you explain it around this dream, nightmare, action. And he went, oh, that's good. So I'm going to write a book about that. And Randy said, go for it.
Oh, good on you. Yeah, I remember one of your posts recently said you were going to finally get to the book writing.
Yeah,
after some nudging and prompting over time. What was the critical deciding moment for you on that then, David?
Oh, there were a couple. Well, one was Randy actually saying, no, this is gold dust. You've got to put this down, which was a lovely thing for him to say. The other thing were a number of people says, it comes back to your point about sort of just the tone that I show up with online. A few people, David Hutchins being one of them, saying, David, you've got to write the book. I mean, it's, your tone of voice, you have a specific tone of voice about the way that you speak and the way that you say things or write things that, you should get your book out there. So I thought I'll go on then, as long as it can be short and as long as it can be practical and just stuff people can do, because there are enough long books out there for business. Yeah.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? It's like, I'm asking that question out of my own sense of curiosity, really. What sparks it? The decision to write.
It's a lovely journey. I reckon if you have one in you, I mean, and that, they say that all of us have got one. It's a lovely journey to go on. I'm very, very lucky on the process I'm doing at the moment with a with a wonderful coach called Debs Jenkins, she's an engineer originally, but is actually really an artist, and she's a great writer, and she's do you know Debs? Do you
No,
know
I
her?
don't. No.
Okay, no, she's wonderful. Actually, she'd be a very good guest on here.
Well, I'll tell you, it's another connection.
Oh yes, there you go.
Another connection. That's right. It's like
Yeah,
chain
but
reaction.
she as an engineer, she has a great process about sort of get this into a rough outline, get this into a working outline, and then come January of next year, I've written the opening story, I've written the end story, which add up to about 1,000 words. It's just the middle 19,000 need going in there somewhere now. I'll get there.
Oh, I like that. I tell you, as we've been talking, the power of story. I had a really fascinating experience this weekend. We had so I've got a large family. We had two of our daughters and their husbands over, and two of my other children with us, and we were reminiscing on an experience where years ago, one of my daughters was driving, and she was driving too fast in wet weather, and going to a roundabout, she approached it and she spanned the car 360 degree, and thankfully no one was hurt, but it was a really frightening experience that sat in the family psyche. And this is probably 10 years ago, somewhere around there. 8 to 10, no, it must be about 8 years ago, 10 years ago. Anyway, my oldest daughter's telling the story, and she thinks she was there.
Oh,
and
how interesting.
everyone else is saying, no, you were not there. There were 5 people in the car, and you were not one of them. And it was really fascinating that she had this realization this weekend that she was not. She's told and heard this story so many times. She actually believed that she was there. And there's the power of story, I think.
Oh, it genuinely is, Simon.
Yeah.
That's lovely. That's lovely, because they do say there are 2 ways to experience things: either actually be there or have the story told to you. Because our brain can't really. Of course, it can make sense that one happened and one didn't, but I mean the patterns kick off, and so it's obviously it's a very emotional story as well, which is the
yes, it is.
That's the power of emotion in story. What is the actually? Do you know what? That's to go back to your previous question of what's the hardest thing to get over is. Getting people to tell a factual story is one thing. Getting them to realise that there is an emotional change that has to happen sometimes is harder to prove. And there was a wonderful client of mine, a woman called Angela, who was European chief executive of a big hotel group, who I remember her saying to me one day, she said, you know what I realise now is that my role as a leader is to read the temperature of the room and change the temperature of the room, and I remember saying, right, I'm stealing that. That's fantastic. I mean,
that is great. That is great.
It is a fantastic line, isn't it? It's just sort of empathize, use all of that, the emotional intelligence and stuff, and realize where people are, and then think it's going to be different when I leave here. Yeah, which has obviously happened. I mean, the emotional intensity of that story in your family is a huge one.
Well, it is, and it's interesting how these stories get retold over time, isn't it? And they're still interesting, and they get bigger and better over time.
It was a Ferrari.
What was it? It was a Nissan Micro, if I remember rightly.
It was. Everyone spins a Nissan Micro.
David, this actually is a really good link to the conversation I had with Simon Lancaster, because he quoted you as using this phrase, scars, talk about scars, not wounds, and which I really loved. And could you tell me a little bit more about that? Because it relates to emotion, I think. It's like maybe some people being a bit scared to go into a story because maybe it's too raw and not appropriate in some respects. Yeah. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Of course, and I wish I knew where I'd heard that, because that certainly isn't my original line. But
right.
Similarly to you, when I heard it, it's another one of those Angela moments. Going, right, I'm having that. So the scars, not the wounds, is comes back to this thing about vulnerability in leadership. It's the journey. It's the things that you've had to overcome, and that is essentially what good story is all about. So going back to the ABT framework, if you were to tell a story that says, I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and everything was great, it's a story because it's a sequence of events. It's just not a great story because there's no but in there. There's no problem. So the scars and the wounds is really about is about flagging up the problem, the but, if you like, what happened in your story. Now, the reason why I say speak from the scar, not the wound, is because then you go into the therefore, the future world of how you came out of it. I genuinely don't believe that people want to be sitting in front of a leader or listening to a leader going and saying, "Oh, my marriage is about to break down and I'm on the verge of bank." You know, nobody wants that. But actually, sort of how they came through these things, the scars they have developed as a result of overcoming problems in their lives, is a great story. And one of my favourite films, in fact, I use this as a model sometimes as a model in training sometimes, is Jaws. And there's that scene where they're all sitting around in the cabin comparing their scars that they got at different points in their lives on different adventures. Right. And it comes back down to the storyteller in chief that you talked about, and it's very easy to watch somebody, you know, on level 23 earning however much they're earning and thinking, wow, I'll never get there. If the leader can share the story of their scars, I went through this and this is how I overcame that, and that's how and I've got the scars to prove it. Yes. I think that's a staggeringly important gift, a genuine gift that leaders can give to people on the way up. And I don't see it used often enough.
Yeah. And I guess this I think there's something else in there, David, around how do you know whether it's a scar or a wound? You know, the timing, and am I sharing too early because there's too much stuff that I haven't processed? There's something around that you have to help anybody with.
I think if you're deep in the pits of something, there is no plan of how to get out of anything, then that's probably not a great story you're telling. Because, I mean, nobody wants the leader to disappear and saying, do you know what? It ain't looking good at the moment. They want to sort of think, but, you know, guess what? We can actually come out the other side. It's an interesting one. And what I'm about to say talks more about the personal element rather than an organizational element, though I think it probably plays into both. I think that there are three sorts of stories, really. There's the public, the ones that we share all the time, that we are very happy. They're just our go-to things that we're very happy to say. There's the personal, which we maybe share occasionally with some people who we feel safe with. And then there's the private, which is even further down, which probably we maybe even don't share with ourselves sometimes. One of the skills of leadership, really, is to think to yourself, how can I elevate some of the personal stories and make them more public? Which ones can I show more publicly? And which of those private ones dare I actually bring up as well? Because I think the ground which we all as human beings work with is incredibly fertile. What there needs to be is the bravery of thinking, is this an appropriate story for me to be able to share now about this is what I went through at this point in my life and this is how I came out of it? Because I do think that sort of elevation of the public ones are easy and probably everyone's got versions of them, but the ones that are private and deeply personal are the ones that we should probably interrogate and think, is there a role for this? Yeah,
good advice. Thank you. Again, I've had a lovely experience in this last year where I've been experimenting with bringing a coaching tool into more of a public arena. So the career timeline of having a leader talk through their career through like a physical timeline, walking up and down the room, kind of looking at different spots at it, but doing that in a public forum. With already contracted with them that they would do it, of course. It's not as a surprise. I had a lovely experience last year. It was a small group. It was only three people in the room, but we were talking about strategy and the way forward. And I thought, well, let's get the owner-founder talking about their, the origin story. Why did they begin this thing? In the process, he latched on to the very start of their organisation where they were gathered around this white plastic table. And it was a place of innovation, a place of creativity, and his whole being started to light up as he talked about this white table. and he went on to talk about other things. But out the back of that, they decided to call their innovation, their R&D function, the white table function, because it, like, everything associated with it, just like his whole physiology changed as he talked about this experience. And they then renamed their R&D, like the white table division, then recruited into this white table division, and the story remains, kind of a year on. But it was dormant. Course. It was a really good example of just like in bringing this thing out of the founder, and actually it was a great catalyst for his whole energy for the business, frankly. But the story was there, but it was hidden.
Yeah,
it was private. I don't know, not intentionally so, but like it was actually unearthing that, and then there was a real magic in it that's gone on.
Simon,
it's been
really
I love that,
and it's sort of. Do you know? Interesting. I do a very similar exercise, except I often get it drawn on a whiteboard. I was working with a team who are in the process of selling their business at the moment, and they are the tech team. And like most businesses, tech actually sits right at the heart of what they do. And they were talking about their journey over the last 4 years, and literally a horizontal line or a sort of straight line timeline, and then above and below the good bits, the bad bits, and sort of seeing how they tie into each other. And I think that's an interesting thing. And what you make me think about there sort of goes into, there is the ABT, the situation, problem, resolution of our stories, the dream, nightmare, action, as I'm talking about it. Yes. But then there are also the key elements of story as well, which actually you just demonstrated very beautifully there, which are essentially time, place, character, and dialogue. I mean, I think those goes back to your question: how can people tell it? If you get those four things, you said, I remember recently I was working with a client on a coaching program, and we were in the room. Immediately, you didn't name names, but recently as a time, your client in a room is a person or a character in a room, and then everything from that. You didn't actually use any dialogue as such, but it was implied there in terms of the conversation that, oh, this is what we did in the white table and everything. That's the musical Hamilton. There's the song in it. I can't remember the exact title, but it's put the people in the room where it happened, and that's the joy of a story: time, place, character, dialogue. I remember. Back in September of last year, I was with Simon. We were sitting there, and Simon said to me, "David, you know what? You should really come on my podcast." That puts you in the room where it happened.
Okay, so that's it. All right, I'm always interested in getting better at this. That was more an impulsive, little story that I told.
You don't need my services. You're very good.
How could that story have been more impactful, based on the things that you've just said?
Okay. Well, You could definitely you could have named the place. You could as soon as you say I was working with a client on a coaching thing, you could have said I was in Brighton working with a client in.
Okay. All right, so I'll start there. So we were in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado.
Well, I'm with you.
The three of us were staying in a 4-story Airbnb, and it was a beautiful location. But it feels like that's a detraction from the story.
No. Okay. So immediately what happens, I was in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. I'm leaning in and my brain is going, okay, something's happening here. Then you say, and I was working with, give me a name of one person. What was the name of one person you were working with? Who was the person who came up with Casey? Excellent. So I was working with Casey on this timeline project. Tell me about the timeline project. Starting with Casey.
So we were trying to define the strategy for the next 18 months, and I had thought about the methods to help do that. That rather than looking forward first, that we would look back at where he'd started from, what had been the origins of the organisation, to help us then to determine where we could get our passions from going forward as well. So that was the scenario of trying to use that with him.
No, that's very good. And now something really interesting happened there, Simon. Without you even having to think about it, suddenly your hands became part of the story. We were looking forward and we were working on this. And suddenly all of that thing about, your head was no longer just the mouthpiece for this story. Suddenly everything. And that's the great thing about the physicality of the story.
was on one buttock as I
Yeah.
was telling the story.
I was talking to Ben Zander, and he was sitting on one bucket, I was sitting on the other one. But I mean, basically, it's really interesting. As soon as you stop, because I imagine that what happened there is there's an element of you being back in the room where it happened in the Rockies, and sort of seeing yourself there and seeing that timeline, and actually sort of there's a great the way that my company's name, the Story Spotters, came about was as a result of a conversation with a wonderful guy called Neil Bearden, who bit of a rock and roll professor at INSEAD, used to be. He was a stats professor, but he also taught he taught storytelling to the MBAs and the EMBAs, and I supported him for a few months during lockdown. And one thing that he always said, he said, listen, let's be honest about this. Get rid of, hero's journey, all that stuff. The basic element that you need to do with storytelling is get the image that's in your head into the image of the people who are listening to you. That's essentially what you were doing there with me. Suddenly it became that much more vivid because you put me in the Rockies. And a guy called Robert Schiller wrote a book called Narrative Economics, which is essentially, funnily enough, and he won, there isn't actually a Nobel Prize for economics, but he won the Nobel Prize for economics for this piece of work about how narratives actually drive movements. And he said, simple, vivid, told often, essentially, because they are repeatable, purely and simply by letting me know the person's name was Casey, that you were in the Rocky Mountains. That story just becomes a little bit more vivid. I will remember it now. It's stuck there.
Great.
With an element of jealousy, because I'd really like to be in the Rockies.
It was a great trip.
Good gig.
We had a good few days there. David, the time is run out for us this afternoon.
Oh,
it's just been just such a pleasure to learn from you and to listen to your stories. As
Simon,
you've shared
I've just
them.
enjoyed this so much.
What's been a learning or a takeaway for you from our conversation today?
In the spirit of primacy and recency, I'm going to go for that last one. The recency thing there is that everything is an opportunity to be practicing this stuff. I really salute you for having taken that opportunity and putting me on the spot and say, come on, David, how can I make this better? Because, I think about it the whole time. I mean, those posts that you mentioned on LinkedIn, you saw the rewrites I did on them. So I mean, it's it just doesn't happen by accident. So that's a high point for me, is your willingness and your daring to sort of say, go on, help me make the Casey story come to life.
Great, and
there's always an
appreciate that.
opportunity to get better at this stuff.
I agree. I want to, actually, and so I'm delighted to have you here and to learn from you. And thank you for your alchemy. Thank you for your alchemy.
A pleasure. You brought me some lovely material to work with.
David, I wish you the best of success with your book and those 19,000 words. And enjoy the journey. Enjoy the journey.
Thanks,
I look forward to reading it on the other side. And perhaps if you're open to that, coming to talk about it another time with us,
I'd love to.
Delighted
I'd genuinely
to hear
love
that.
to. Thank you, Simon.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Thank you. All right.
Take care.
Wish you the best of success. Thank you. Our after dinner leadership conversation is finished. Our guest has left, and you're still here. Now, of course, you're very welcome. I'm glad that you found the conversation to be engaging. There's a few things that I'd like to ask you to do before you do leave. The first one of those is, if you can stop and think about somebody who you think would enjoy this conversation, a friend, a colleague, perhaps an aspiring leader. The second thing is to stop and hit subscribe or follow. And then the third thing is to start doing something. Perhaps there's a little idea or a concept that we've been discussing today that you think you could apply even a little bit tomorrow, tonight, and to put it into action. I encourage you to use this as a catalyst to do something different, do something more interesting, do something more exciting. And thank you so much for joining us. And please tune in again for another after dinner leadership conversation. You can leave now. I need to go and do the dishes.